The year was 2287 and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. For 15 years, Earth had been part of the Galactic Council, a vast organization that governed hundreds of worlds and dozens of species across known space. But being part of the Council did not mean being equal to the older races. The Vexari were reptilian warriors who valued honor above all else. The Thal Collective were insectoid beings who controlled much of the galaxy's trade. The Meridian Hive operated as a single consciousness spread across millions of bodies. The Krell Dominion were ancient and powerful, keeping mostly to themselves. These four species dominated the Council, and they had never truly accepted humanity as their equals. Daniel Hayes represented Earth at Nexus Prime, the massive diplomatic station that orbited a dying neutron star in neutral space. The station was enormous, large enough to house representatives from every Council species along with their staff and security forces. Daniel had worked there for 6 years, and in that time he had learned to navigate the complex web of galactic politics. He knew which species could be reasoned with and which ones would never see humans as anything more than aggressive newcomers. The Vexari in particular seemed to despise everything about humanity. They called humans reckless and violent, too quick to anger and too slow to understand the old ways. The trouble started when the colony ship New Horizon went silent. The ship had been carrying 3,000 colonists to a new world in the outer frontier, a region of space that both humans and Vexari had been expanding into. One day the ship was sending regular status updates, and the next day there was nothing. Daniel immediately requested a council investigation, but the response was dismissive. The Thal representative suggested mechanical failure. The Meridian Hive claimed the ship had likely strayed into an asteroid field. The Vexari said nothing at all, which Daniel found more troubling than any excuse. Kate Morrison was Daniel's assistant, and she was the one who found the first real evidence. A merchant captain named Gregory Dunn had been hauling cargo through that sector when the New Horizon disappeared. He came to Kate in secret and showed her sensor logs from his ship. The logs showed Vexari warships in the area, 3 of them moving in formation near the colony ship's last known position. There were also fragments of a distress call that Gregory had managed to record before his equipment failed. The voice on the recording was panicked and spoke of being boarded by unknown hostiles. Daniel took this evidence to a closed council session. He stood before representatives of every major species and presented everything he had gathered. The sensor logs, the distress call fragments, testimony from Gregory Dunn and 2 other freighter captains who had seen similar things. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice calm but firm. He demanded an investigation. He demanded answers. And he made it clear that Earth would not simply accept the loss of 3,000 lives without knowing what happened to them. The council listened in cold silence. When Daniel finished speaking, the Vexari representative, a scarred warrior named Kethral, stood slowly. He said that humans were always quick to make accusations without proof. He said that Daniel was trying to create conflict where none existed. He suggested that perhaps the colony ship had been attempting to enter restricted space and had suffered the consequences of their own recklessness. The other council members nodded along, some more enthusiastically than others. No investigation was approved. The matter was considered closed. 3 days later, Daniel Hayes vanished from his quarters on Nexus Prime. Kate arrived for their morning briefing and found his door unlocked and his rooms empty. His personal belongings were all in place, his data pad was on his desk, but Daniel himself was gone. She immediately contacted station security. The response team arrived, but they seemed more interested in asking Kate questions than in actually searching for Daniel. The security chief, a Thal named Vrix, suggested that Daniel had left the station voluntarily. Perhaps he had grown tired of his duties and returned to Earth without telling anyone. Kate knew that was impossible. Daniel would never abandon his post, especially not now with the New Horizon investigation still unresolved. She began searching his quarters herself, and that was when she found the signs of struggle. A chair was slightly out of place. Scratch marks on the floor suggested something heavy had been dragged, and when she checked his drinking water, she found traces of a sedative mixed into it. Someone had drugged Daniel and taken him while he was unconscious. She tried to report her findings to station security, but Vrix dismissed her concerns. He said she was overreacting and that the scratches on the floor were old maintenance marks. When Kate insisted on filing an official report, Vrix told her to come back in the morning with proper documentation. Kate returned to her own quarters to gather evidence and prepare a formal complaint. She never made it through the night. Station security found her rooms empty the next morning, just as they had found Daniel's. The news reached Earth within hours. The unified Earth government had been monitoring the situation closely ever since Daniel first reported the disappearance of the New Horizon. When word came that both their ambassador and his assistant had vanished under suspicious circumstances, the response was immediate. President Marcus Glenn called an emergency session of the Earth Council. Glenn was not a career politician. He had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps, rising through the ranks during the Jupiter skirmishes and the Mars Rebellion. He had seen combat on 3 different worlds, and he understood something that the alien species did not seem to grasp about humanity. Humans did not back down when threatened. They did not accept injustice quietly, and they certainly did not forget when their people were taken. The emergency session lasted only 2 hours. President Glenn stood before the assembled representatives of every Earth nation and territory. He laid out the facts clearly and without embellishment. 3,000 colonists missing and presumed dead, an ambassador who had demanded justice and was now gone, an assistant who had tried to help and had also disappeared. Evidence that pointed clearly toward Vexari involvement. A galactic council that refused to act. Glenn's voice was steady when he made his announcement. The time for diplomacy had passed. Earth would not send another ambassador to plead for justice. They would not file more reports or gather more evidence that would be ignored. The Galactic Council had been given a chance to do what was right, and they had chosen to protect the powerful instead of seeking truth. That was their choice, and they would have to live with the consequences. Earth would respond in the only language that the Vexari seemed to understand. They would send their soldiers instead of their diplomats. They would find Daniel Hayes and Kate Morrison. They would learn what happened to the New Horizon. And they would make it absolutely clear that humanity would not tolerate the disappearance of its citizens, whether it was 3,000 colonists or a single ambassador. President Glenn's final words were broadcast across Earth and to every human colony in space. They silenced our messenger, he said, so now we send our soldiers. The Terran Defense Coalition mobilized within the hour. Warships that had been patrolling the outer colonies turned toward Vexari space. Marine battalions that had been training on Mars were loaded onto transport ships. The entire military apparatus of humanity, built over decades of expansion and conflict, began moving with a single purpose. The galaxy was about to learn something that Earth had known for centuries. When you push humans too far, when you take something precious from them, they do not negotiate. They do not compromise. They come with fire and steel, and they do not stop until justice is done. The Vexari had wanted silence, and they would get their answer soon enough. But it would not be the silence they expected. It would be the silence that comes after battle. When the smoke clears and the victors stand over the defeated. Admiral Helen Cross received her orders while her flagship, the carrier Resolute, was docked at Luna Station for routine maintenance. The orders were simple and direct. Take a fleet into Vexari space, locate the ambassador and bring him home by any means necessary. Show the galaxy that Earth protects its own. Helen read the orders 3 times and then smiled. She had been waiting for this moment for years. Admiral Helen Cross stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched as the last of her fleet assembled around the carrier. 12 warships in total, each one crewed by men and women who had volunteered for this mission, knowing full well they might not return. 4 heavy cruisers formed the main battle line, their armor thick enough to withstand hits from weapons that could crack a moon in half. 6 stealth frigates hung back in formation, their hulls coated with materials that made them nearly invisible to enemy sensors. 2 destroyers flanked the Resolute, ready to screen for incoming threats. It was not the largest fleet Earth had ever assembled, but it was one of the most dangerous. Helen had spent 40 years in the Terran Defense Coalition, and she had seen humanity grow from a single system, species to a power that controlled 15 colonies across 3 sectors. She had fought in the Jupiter skirmishes when Mars tried to break away from Earth control. She had commanded a frigate during the asteroid wars when mining corporations went to war over resource rights. She knew combat, and she knew how to win against opponents who thought they were superior. The Vexari were about to learn a hard lesson about underestimating humans. Colonel Jake Martinez arrived on the bridge to give his final report before departure. He commanded the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, 2,000 of the best soldiers Earth had ever produced. They were loaded onto transport ships attached to the Resolute, ready to deploy the moment they found their target. Jake was a veteran of 4 planetary assaults, and his reputation among the Marines was legendary. He did not waste words, and he did not accept failure. Helen trusted him completely. The mission briefing came from Lieutenant Commander Amy Fisher, the Resolute's intelligence officer. Amy had spent the last 72 hours gathering every piece of information available about Vexari space and their military capabilities. She stood before the senior staff and laid out what they were facing. The Vexari operated a network of secret facilities throughout their territory, places where they took individuals who opposed their agenda. These facilities were never acknowledged publicly, and the Galactic Council pretended they did not exist. But intelligence gathered from defectors and intercepted communications told a different story. One facility in particular kept appearing in the reports. It was called the Silence, and it was hidden deep in an asteroid field near the border of Vexari space. The facility was supposedly impossible to reach. Without proper authorization, codes, and any ship that tried to navigate the asteroid field, without those codes, would be torn apart by the chaotic gravitational forces. Amy believed this was where Ambassador Daniel Hayes and Kate Morrison had been taken. It was where dozens of other missing diplomats and activists had disappeared over the years. Commander Ryan Blake was assigned to solve the navigation problem. Ryan had spent 15 years working as an asteroid miner before joining the military, and he knew how to read the patterns in debris fields that other pilots missed. He studied the sensor data from the region around the Silence and began plotting a course that would take advantage of gravitational eddies and stable flight corridors. It would be dangerous, and it would require perfect timing, but Ryan was confident he could get the fleet through. The departure from Luna Station was broadcast across Earth. Millions watched as the Resolute and her escort ships fired their engines and began accelerating toward the jump point. President Glenn gave a brief statement reminding everyone why this mission was necessary. The Vexari had silenced Earth's voice at the Council, and now they would face the consequences. He did not threaten, he did not bluster. He simply stated the facts and let the images of the departing fleet speak for themselves. The fleet jumped into Vexari space without requesting permission or announcing their arrival. The moment they crossed the border, every alarm system on Nexus Prime began screaming warnings. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within minutes. The Thal Collective representative demanded that Earth recall their fleet immediately. The Meridian Hive threatened economic sanctions. The Krell Dominion said nothing, but their warships began moving toward defensive positions around their own territory. The Vexari response was predictable. They sent their own fleet to intercept the human ships before they could penetrate deeper into Vexari space. War leader Thexmore commanded the Vexari interception force. He was a decorated veteran who had fought in dozens of campaigns, and he viewed humans as little more than primitive animals playing at being civilized. His fleet consisted of 30 warships, more than twice the number Helen had brought. The Vexari ships were larger and more heavily armed, built using technology that was centuries more advanced than anything Earth possessed. Thexmore was confident this would be a short engagement. He would destroy the human fleet, capture any survivors, and use this incident to finally convince the Council to restrict human expansion. The two fleets met at the edge of the Kryn Nebula, a vast cloud of ionized gas and radiation that stretched across dozens of light years. Thexmore sent a transmission to the Resolute demanding immediate surrender. Admiral Cross received the message, waited exactly 5 seconds, and then responded with 2 words that became famous across the galaxy. Come try. The battle began with the Vexari ships advancing in a standard formation, their heavy weapons charging for a devastating first strike. But the human fleet did something unexpected. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, they scattered and dove into the nebula itself. The radiation inside the cloud was intense enough to scramble most sensor systems, and the Vexari ships hesitated before following. That hesitation cost them dearly. Human fighters launched from the Resolute while the carrier was still inside the nebula. The small craft used the radiation as cover and emerged behind the Vexari formation. Lieutenant Sophie Turner led her squadron in a coordinated strike against the enemy cruisers, targeting their engine systems and sensor arrays. The Vexari had never seen human fighters in action before, and they were completely unprepared for the speed and aggression of the attack. 3 cruisers were crippled in the first pass. The frigates emerged next, appearing on enemy sensors like ghosts materializing from nothing. They fired spreads of missiles and then vanished back into the nebula before return fire could lock onto them. The Vexari fleet tried to adapt, but they were fighting an enemy that refused to follow the standard rules of engagement. Human ships did not line up for traditional exchanges of fire. They struck from unexpected angles, used the environment to their advantage, and coordinated their attacks with a precision that spoke of decades of practice. Commander Ryan Blake piloted the Resolute through the nebula like he was navigating a familiar highway. He knew exactly where the radiation was thickest and where the clear corridors allowed for quick movement. The carrier would appear long enough to launch another wing of fighters or fire a volley from its main guns, then disappear back into the glowing clouds before the Vexari could target it effectively. Thexmore realized too late that he had made a terrible mistake. The humans were not fighting a conventional battle. They were hunting. The cruiser Valiant, one of the 4 heavy ships in Helen's fleet, engaged 3 Vexari destroyers in close combat. The human ship was smaller and should have been outmatched, but Captain Laura Chen commanded her vessel with skill that bordered on artistry. She used the Valiant's superior maneuverability to stay inside the enemy firing arcs, placing her ship where the Vexari weapons could not track properly. When one destroyer tried to ram her, she fired emergency thrusters that sent the Valiant spinning away while launching a spread of torpedoes directly into the enemy's bow. The destroyer broke apart. The battle raged for 3 hours. The space around the Kryn Nebula filled with debris and escape pods from damaged ships. The Vexari fleet, built for traditional warfare between massive capital ships, found itself being systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought like pirates and struck like lightning. When Thexmore finally ordered a retreat, he had lost 8 ships completely destroyed, and another dozen so badly damaged they would need months of repairs. The human fleet had lost 1 vessel. The frigate Defiant took a direct hit from a Vexari dreadnought while covering the retreat of a damaged cruiser. Captain Benjamin Cole knew his ship was dying, and he made a choice that saved the rest of the fleet. He ordered his crew to evacuate, overrode the safety systems, and aimed his crippled ship directly at the dreadnought. The Defiant's reactor went critical seconds before impact. The explosion consumed both vessels. 93 crew members died, but their sacrifice allowed the fleet to press forward. Admiral Cross stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched the enemy fleet jump away to safety. Around her, the surviving ships of her fleet regrouped and began damage assessments. The victory was significant, but Helen felt no joy. She thought of the Defiant's crew, of Captain Cole who had chosen death over retreat, of the families back on Earth who would receive notifications that their loved ones were not coming home. War always had a cost, and Helen understood that better than most. The fleet resumed its course toward the Silence. Behind them, the galaxy reacted to news of the battle with shock and disbelief. Humanity had just defeated a superior Vexarii force and proven that Earth's military. The asteroid field surrounding the Silence was designed to be a death trap. Thousands of massive rocks tumbled through space in chaotic patterns, their movements influenced by gravitational forces that shifted constantly. Any ship attempting to navigate without the proper codes would be crushed between colliding asteroids or torn apart by gravitational shears. The Vexari had chosen this location specifically because they believed it was impenetrable. They had not counted on Commander Ryan Blake. Ryan stood in the navigation center of the Resolute and studied the sensor data with the practiced eye of someone who had spent half his life in asteroid fields. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. The gravitational eddies had rhythms, and the asteroid movements followed predictable cycles if you knew what to look for. He plotted a course that would take the fleet through the safest corridors, timing each movement to coincide with brief windows when the paths were clear. It would require perfect coordination, and there would be no room for error, but Ryan had navigated worse. The stealth frigates went first, slipping into the field one at a time and following Ryan's plotted course exactly. Their sensor-absorbing hulls made them nearly invisible, and they moved slowly to avoid creating any disturbances that might alert the station's defenses. Commander Ryan Blake watched from the Resolute as each frigate disappeared into the tumbling maze of rock and metal. One by one they emerged on the other side, taking up positions around the Silence and waiting for the assault to begin. Colonel Jake Martinez gathered his Marines in the transport bay and went over the mission one final time. They would breach the station through multiple entry points simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize a proper response. Intelligence suggested the silence housed between 200 and 300 Vexari guards along with unknown numbers of prisoners. The Marines would need to move fast, secure the detention areas, and evacuate everyone before Vexari reinforcements arrived. Jake looked at the faces of his soldiers and saw determination mixed with nervous energy. They were ready. The assault began at exactly 0400 hours station time. The frigates moved in close and launched boarding pods that attached to the Silence's hull like metallic limpets. Cutting torches burned through the outer armor and Marines poured into the station through the breaches. Sergeant Lisa Grant led 2nd Platoon through a maintenance corridor that intelligence said connected to the detention level. The corridors were narrow and dark, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of red. The Marines moved in practiced formation, their powered armor allowing them to glide through the zero-gravity environment with ease. The first contact came when 3rd Platoon breached into what they thought was a storage bay, but turned out to be a barracks. Vexari guards scrambled for weapons, but the Marines had surprise on their side. The firefight lasted less than a minute, and when it was over, 15 guards were dead and the Marines were pushing deeper into the station. The sound of gunfire echoed through the metal corridors and alarms began, screaming throughout the facility. Sergeant Lisa Grant's platoon reached the detention level and found it, guarded by a reinforced security door. 2 Marines placed breaching charges while the rest of the platoon took up defensive positions. The explosion blew the door inward and the Marines rushed through into a large chamber filled with rows of stasis pods. Each pod contained a prisoner held in suspended animation, their life signs barely registering on the monitors. Lisa started checking the pods one by one, looking for Ambassador Daniel Hayes and Kate Morrison. She found Daniel in pod 17, his face pale and his breathing shallow, but his vital signs stable. Kate was in pod 23, also alive but unconscious. Lisa immediately called for medical teams and began the process of bringing both humans out of stasis. But as she worked, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were dozens of other pods, and they contained beings from at least 10 different species. The Silence was not just holding a few political prisoners. It was a mass detention facility that had been operating for years. Colonel Jake Martinez pushed toward the station's command center with 1st Platoon. They fought through increasingly desperate resistance as Vexari guards realized what was happening. The Marines moved with brutal efficiency, clearing rooms and neutralizing threats with the kind of speed that came from endless training. Jake had fought on 4 different worlds and he knew how to read a battle. The Vexari were brave, but they were not prepared for the sheer aggression of the human assault. The command center fell after a 10-minute firefight that left 20 Vexari dead and 3 Marines wounded. Jake immediately ordered his technical specialist to start downloading everything from the station's computer systems. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The Vexari had not just been holding prisoners at the Silence. They had been conducting experiments on them. Medical records detailed interrogations that crossed into torture, psychological tests designed to break the will of different species, and research into biological weaknesses that could be exploited in future conflicts. Private Nathan Ross was part of the technical team, and he stared at his screen in horror as file after file revealed the extent of the Vexari crimes. There were records going back decades, prisoners who had been held for years, experiments that had resulted in deaths. He looked at Colonel Martinez and said they needed to make this public. Jake agreed immediately. He ordered the entire database transmitted directly to Nexus Prime, to every major news network in the galaxy, and to the embassies of every species that had citizens imprisoned in the Silence. The transmission went out on all frequencies and could not be stopped or blocked. Within minutes, representatives across the galaxy were receiving detailed evidence of Vexari war crimes. The response was immediate and chaotic. Species who had lost diplomats and activists years ago suddenly had confirmation of what had happened to them. The Galactic Council's communication channels lit up with demands for explanations and calls for justice. The Vexari could no longer deny what they had done because the evidence was now public and undeniable. Sergeant Lisa Grant oversaw the evacuation of the prisoners as medical. Teams worked to safely bring each one out of stasis. The process was delicate because some of the prisoners had been held for so long that their bodies needed careful monitoring as they returned to consciousness. Ambassador Daniel Hayes was among the first awake, and despite his weakened condition, he immediately asked about Kate and the other prisoners. Lisa assured him everyone would be evacuated and told him that Earth had come for him just as he knew they would. Outside the station, Admiral Helen Cross watched as the evacuation proceeded according to plan. But her sensors were also tracking something else. A Vexari fleet was approaching fast, larger than the one they had fought at the Kryn Nebula. War leader Thexmore was coming with everything he had left, and he was not interested in negotiation. Helen gave the order for the fleet to prepare for combat. They would hold the line as long as necessary to get every prisoner off that station. Lieutenant Sophie Turner launched from the Resolute with her squadron to buy time for the evacuation. Her fighter screen spread out to meet the incoming Vexari ships, and the second battle began. Sophie had always loved flying, and she moved her fighter through the asteroid field like it was an extension of her own body. She took down 2 enemy interceptors in the first pass and damaged a third before she had to break away and evade return fire. Her helmet camera recorded everything, and her voice remained calm as she called out targets and coordinated with her wingmates. The main Vexari fleet arrived and began hammering the human ships with heavy weapons fire. The cruiser Valiant took a direct hit that nearly split her in half, but Captain Laura Chen kept her ship in the fight. She redirected all power to weapons and engines, abandoned the damaged sections, and continued firing even as her vessel came apart around her. The Valiant finally broke up after taking a hit to her reactor, but by then all her crew had evacuated, and Laura was the last one off, floating in her survival suit and watching her ship die. The evacuation shuttles began launching from the Silence carrying the freed prisoners. Marine pilots pushed their craft to the limit, getting through the asteroid field and back to the fleet. Sergeant Lisa Grant was on the last shuttle with Ambassador Daniel Hayes and Kate Morrison. They watched through the viewports as the human fleet fought to protect their escape. Daniel saw ships dying to save him and the other prisoners, and he felt the weight of every sacrifice. Colonel Jake Martinez set the final charges throughout the Silence. The station would not be allowed to continue operating, and the Vexari would not be given a chance to hide the evidence of what they had done here. He walked through the empty corridors one last time, making sure every prisoner had been evacuated and every piece of data had been transmitted. When he was certain nothing remained, he armed the charges and took the last shuttle off the station. Admiral Helen Cross watched her tactical display as the last shuttle docked with the Resolute. All personnel were accounted for and all prisoners were secure. She gave the order to withdraw. The fleet began pulling back from the asteroid field as the charges aboard the Silence detonated. The explosions are. The Galactic Council chamber on Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos. Representatives from hundreds of species crowded into the massive hall, all of them demanding answers and explanations. The evidence transmitted from the Silence had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and no one could ignore what it revealed. The Vexari had been kidnapping diplomats and activists for decades, torturing them, experimenting on them, and the Council had either known about it or chosen not to look. Either way, the trust that held the Council together was fracturing. The tribunal was called 3 days after the rescue operation. The Vexari demanded that Earth be held accountable for what they called an unprovoked military assault on their sovereign territory. They wanted Admiral Helen Cross arrested and tried for war crimes. They wanted Colonel Jake Martinez charged with murder. They wanted compensation for their destroyed ships and facilities. War leader Thexmore stood before the Council and spoke of human aggression, of their refusal to follow proper diplomatic channels, of their disregard for galactic law. His voice was strong, but many in the chamber noticed he never mentioned the prisoners or the evidence found at the Silence. President Marcus Glenn arrived at Nexus Prime aboard the Resolute 3 hours before the tribunal was scheduled to begin. He had not sent a delegation of diplomats or lawyers. He came himself, flanked by Admiral Cross and Ambassador Daniel Hayes. The ambassador still bore the marks of his captivity, his face gaunt and his movements slow, but he refused to stay behind on Earth. He wanted to face the Council and tell them exactly what had been done to him. The tribunal began with the Vexari presenting their case. They had prepared extensively, and their arguments were designed to paint humanity as dangerous warmongers who could not be trusted. They showed footage of the battle at Kryn Nebula, edited to make it appear that human ships had fired first. They displayed images of destroyed Vexari vessels and read the names of their dead warriors. They spoke of the Silence as a legitimate detention facility for dangerous criminals, and claimed the humans had released terrorists and murderers back into civilized space. It was a masterful performance, and many in the chamber seemed swayed by their words. Then it was Earth's turn to speak. President Glenn declined to take the podium himself. Instead, he gestured to Ambassador Daniel Hayes, and the chamber fell silent as the man who had been at the center of everything walked slowly to the speaker's platform. Daniel did not have prepared remarks or carefully crafted arguments. He simply told the truth. He described his investigation into the missing colony ship New Horizon and the evidence he had gathered showing Vexari involvement. He detailed how he presented that evidence to the council and how it was dismissed without investigation. He spoke quietly about waking up drugged and disoriented in a stasis pod, about the months that followed as he drifted in and out of consciousness while Vexari interrogators tried to break his mind. The chamber was completely silent as Daniel spoke. He did not raise his voice or show anger. He simply stated what had happened to him, and then he began presenting the evidence recovered from the silence. File after file, record after record, he showed the council exactly what the Vexari had been doing. There were medical reports detailing experiments conducted on living subjects. There were interrogation logs describing torture methods used to extract information. There were lists of prisoners dating back 30 years, many of whom had never been seen again. Daniel read names and species and showed pictures when they were available. The list went on for over an hour. When Daniel finally finished, the chamber remained silent for several long moments. Then something unexpected happened. A Krell representative stood from his seat in the gallery. His name was Eric Stone, and he was a freighter captain who had been attending the tribunal as an observer. Eric walked down to the chamber floor without asking permission and approached the speaker's platform. He looked at the council representatives and said that his brother had been a Krell diplomat who disappeared 15 years ago while investigating trade violations in Vexari space. The family was told he had died in a shuttle accident, but his body was never recovered. Eric had just seen his brother's name on the list of prisoners held at the silence. One by one, other representatives began to stand. A Thal scientist whose colleague had vanished 10 years ago, a Meridian merchant whose sister went missing while traveling through Vexari territory, a junior diplomat from a small species that most council members barely knew existed, who told of how his government's ambassador had disappeared after speaking out against Vexari expansion. The stories kept coming, and each one added to the weight of evidence against the Vexari. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Anyone who opposed Vexari interests had been at risk of disappearing, and the council had done nothing to stop it. War leader Thexmore tried to respond, but his words rang hollow against the testimony of so many species. He claimed the prisoners had been dangerous criminals, that they had posed threats to galactic stability, that the Vexari had been protecting the council from chaos. But when pressed to provide evidence of these crimes, he had nothing. The records from the silence showed that most prisoners had been guilty of nothing more than speaking against Vexari policies or investigating Vexari activities. Then, Thexmore made a mistake that sealed his species' fate. He stood and declared that the strong had always ruled the weak, that this was the natural order of the galaxy, and that species like humanity needed to be controlled before they upset the balance of power. He said the Vexari had been maintaining order for centuries, and that the council should be grateful for their vigilance. His words were meant to be defiant, but instead they sounded like a confession. He was admitting that the Vexari believed they had the right to imprison or eliminate anyone they viewed as a threat. The vote to censure the Vexari dominion was nearly unanimous. Only 3 species voted against the measure, and they were all longtime Vexari allies who had benefited from their protection. The censure stripped the Vexari of their seat on the Council's Security Committee, revoked their authorization to conduct military operations outside their own borders, and demanded the immediate release of any remaining prisoners held in Vexari facilities. The Vexari delegation walked out of the chamber rather than accept the verdict. War leader Thexmore paused at the exit and looked back at President Glenn with pure hatred in his eyes. This was not over. President Glenn stepped to the speaker's platform after the Vexari left. He looked around the chamber at the hundreds of representatives and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. He said that Earth had not come seeking war or conquest. They had come seeking justice for their people, and in doing so they had uncovered crimes that affected dozens of species. He said that humanity would always stand against tyranny and oppression no matter what form it took. He made it clear that Earth would defend not just their own citizens, but any species that faced similar threats. The message was simple and direct. The galaxy had changed and humanity would be part of shaping its future. The speech was broadcast across Earth and to every human colony. Celebrations erupted in the streets as people realized what had been accomplished. Their ambassador had been rescued, a terrible injustice had been exposed, and Earth had proven itself to be a power that could stand against the old empires. Young people watched the footage and saw a future where humanity was not just surviving among the stars, but thriving and making a difference. But not everyone was celebrating. In the core systems of the Vexari Dominion, war leader Thexmore met with military commanders and political leaders. The censure had been a humiliation that could not be allowed to stand. The Vexari had ruled their region of space for thousands of years, and they would not bow to upstart humans or a council that had betrayed them. Thexmore began planning his response. If the council would not respect Vexari power, then the Vexari would remind them why they had been feared for so long. The military buildup began immediately. Vexari shipyards went to full production, building new warships to replace those lost in the battles with humanity. Reserve forces were called up and training intensified. Thexmore reached out to fringe groups and militant factions that had their own grievances against the council. He offered them weapons, ships, and support in exchange for their alliance. A coalition began forming in the shadows, united by resentment of the council and hatred of humanity. Admiral Helen Cross watched the intelligence reports coming in from Vexari space with growing concern. She had known the victory at the tribunal would not be the end of things. The Vexari were too proud to accept defeat and too powerful to ignore. She sent recommendations to Earth's military command suggesting they prepare for a larger conflict. President Glenn read her reports and authorized the expansion of the fleet. New ships were laid down in orbital yards around Earth and Mars. Recruitment centers were flooded with volunteers who wanted to serve after seeing what the military had accomplished. Ambassador Daniel Hayes returned to his post at Nexus Prime, but he was a changed man. The months in captivity had left scars that would never fully heal. He had nightmares about the interrogation sessions, and sometimes he would wake up disoriented, unsure if he was S. The attack came without warning on a cold morning in March. Draven Station was a joint research facility operated by humans and the Thol Collective, studying advanced propulsion systems that might allow faster travel between distant stars. The station housed 300 scientists, technicians, and support staff, along with a small security detachment. It orbited a gas giant in neutral space far from any major military installations. Admiral Victor Lang commanded the station, and he ran it with the same careful attention to detail that had made him one of Earth's most respected officers. He was also one of Admiral Helen Cross's closest friends. The Vexari attack fleet dropped out of jump space directly on top of the station. 30 warships surrounded Draven before anyone could react. There was no warning, no demands for surrender, no attempt at communication. The Vexari simply opened fire with every weapon they had. The station's shields lasted less than a minute under the overwhelming assault. Missiles tore through the hull, decompressing entire sections and killing everyone inside. Energy weapons melted the station's superstructure and turned living quarters into crematoriums. The few security personnel who managed to reach their fighters were shot down before they could even launch. Admiral Lang sent out a distress signal in the first 30 seconds of the attack. The message was brief and desperate. Draven Station under attack by Vexari forces. Multiple breaches. Heavy casualties. Request immediate assistance. Then the communication array was destroyed and the signal went dead. Victor stayed at his post on the command deck as the station came apart around him. He coordinated evacuation efforts and tried to save as many people as possible, but the attack was too sudden and too vicious. When a missile struck the command deck directly, Victor Lang died instantly along with everyone else who had stayed to help others escape. The massacre lasted 18 minutes. When the Vexari fleet jumped away, they left behind nothing but debris and bodies floating in space. Of the 300 people stationed at Draven, only 42 survived. They were picked up hours later by a passing merchant vessel that responded to automated distress beacons. The survivors told stories of systematic slaughter, of Vexari ships targeting escape pods and shooting down anyone who tried to flee. This was not a military operation. It was murder. News of the attack reached Earth within hours, and the response was immediate. President Marcus Glenn appeared on every broadcast channel and declared a state of emergency. He called the attack an act of war and promised that Earth would respond with overwhelming force. The Galactic Council convened, but this time there were no debates about procedure or jurisdiction. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The Vexari had attacked a civilian research station in neutral space and killed hundreds of innocent people. Even species that had previously defended the Vexari now condemned the attack. Admiral Helen Cross learned about Draven Station while her fleet was conducting training exercises near Jupiter. She read the casualty list and saw Victor Lang's name at the top. They had served together for 20 years, and Victor had been at her wedding when she married her husband. He had been godfather to her daughter. The grief hit her like a physical blow, but Helen was a professional. She locked the pain away in a place where it could not interfere with her duty, and she began planning Earth's response. President Glenn authorized Operation Reckoning within 6 hours of the attack. The objective was simple and brutal: cripple the Vexari military so thoroughly that they would never again be able to threaten civilian populations. Helen was given command of the largest fleet Earth had ever assembled. 40 warships including carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Thal Collective contributed 12 ships of their own, the first time they had ever committed military forces to support another species. Several smaller council members also pledged ships or logistical support. The coalition that formed was unprecedented in galactic history. General Jake Martinez, promoted after his success at the Silence, commanded the ground forces. He had 2 full Marine divisions, nearly 10,000 soldiers along with support units and special operations teams. The plan called for a 2-pronged assault. The fleet would engage and destroy the Vexari Navy, while Marines would capture key facilities and infrastructure. The goal was not occupation, but rather to break the Vexari ability to project military power beyond their own borders. The fleet jumped into Vexari space and headed directly for their homeworld. There was no subtlety this time, no attempt at stealth or deception. Earth wanted the Vexari to see them coming and to understand that this was not a raid, but an invasion. War leader Thexmore, now supreme commander of all Vexari forces, assembled every ship he could muster for the defense of the homeworld. His fleet numbered over 60 vessels, but many were older designs that had been pulled from reserve status. The Vexari had been building new ships as fast as possible, but they had not had time to replace everything lost in previous battles. The 2 fleets met in orbit around Vexari Prime, and the battle that followed was the largest space engagement in galactic history. Human ships moved in coordinated battle groups, their tactics refined through months of training and combat experience. The Thal ships provided heavy fire support, their energy weapons capable of punching through even the thickest armor. Vexari defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing they were protecting their homeworld, but courage alone could not overcome the numerical and tactical disadvantage they faced. Lieutenant Sophie Turner flew her fighter through the chaos of the orbital battle. She had been promoted to squadron leader after her actions at the Silence, and she led her pilots with the same aggressive style that had made her famous. Her squadron targeted Vexari command ships, taking out their communication arrays and sensor systems to create confusion in their formations. Sophie took a hit that damaged her fighter's engines, but she kept flying, using momentum and thrusters to stay in the fight even as her craft slowly lost power. General Jake Martinez led the assault on Vexari Prime's orbital defense platforms. These massive stations protected the planet from orbital bombardment, and they needed to be neutralized before the blockade could be completed. Marines and drop pods launched from the fleet and burned through the atmosphere toward the platforms. The Vexari defenders were ready this time, and the fighting was intense. Jake's Marines took heavy casualties, but they pushed forward through the platforms one by one, disabling weapons and destroying shield generators. Private Ethan Cole was part of the assault on Platform 7. He was 22 years old, and this was his first real combat operation. His father had been aboard the colony ship New Horizon, and Ethan had joined the Marines specifically to fight the Vexari who killed him. When his platoon breached into Platform 7, they encountered fierce resistance. The Vexari guards fought room by room, refusing to surrender even when their position was hopeless. Ethan saw friends die in those corridors, and he learned what war really meant beyond the training simulations. The battle for the orbital platforms lasted 6 hours. When the last platform fell silent, the way was clear for the fleet to establish a complete blockade of Vexari Prime. No ships would be allowed to leave, and no supplies would reach the surface. Admiral Cross broadcast a message to the planet below. She demanded the surrender of Supreme Commander Thexmore and all military forces. She promised that civilians would not be harmed, but warned that any attempt to break the blockade would be met with overwhelming force. Thexmore responded from his flagship, the Dominion's Fury, which was badly damaged but still operational. He refused to surrender and called on all loyal Vexari to fight to the last breath. He said that defeat was preferable to submission, and that the Vexari would never bow to inferior species. His words were broadcast across his fleet, and for a moment it seemed like the battle would continue. Then something unexpected happened. Several Vexari ship captains broke formation and moved away from the combat zone. They broadcast messages saying they would not throw away more lives in a war that was already lost. The mutiny spread quickly. More ships withdrew from combat, and some even powered down their weapons entirely. Thexmore ordered the defectors to return to formation, but they ignored him. The Supreme Commander found himself commanding a fleet that no longer believed in his cause. In a final act of defiance, Thexmore armed his flagship's reactor for self-destruction. He broadcast one last message saying that he would never accept defeat, and that the Vexari would rise again. Then the Dominion's Fury exploded in a flash of light that could be seen from the planet's surface. With their commander dead and their fleet shattered, the remaining Vexari forces surrendered. The battle was over, and Earth had won a complete victory. The cost had been high, with thousands of casualties on both sides, but the objective had been achieved. The Vexari would no longer be able to threaten their neighbors or prey on weaker species. The Council sent representatives to negotiate surrender terms, and Admiral Cross welcomed them aboard the Resolute. The terms were harsh but fair. Complete disarmament, reparations for the victims of Draven Station and other attacks, war crime trials for those responsible for the Silence and similar facilities. President Glenn traveled to Vexari Prime, F,